Okay, so we are in week 3 and we are talking about the diagnostic side of intervention. So diagnosis and data analysis preparation. We have just 7 slides tonight. There's a lot of information on these slides though, but it's just 7. And now we're down to 6. So I mentioned to you in week 1, maybe 2, that some of what you're doing in these assignments, some of you will get ahead of yourself because, it's like, oh, wait, if I include this, I also want to include this information, and that's okay. But just know that you may see something in a next week, like a week 3 or week 4, or whatever, where you're like, oh, wait, I think I already wrote that information out, and that's okay to go back and use it. That's totally fine. Is just make sure that it is what is being asked for and that it's relevant. So the whole point of the diagnosis here is really for informed decision making, right? That's why we collect data in organizations, so that we can make these informed decisions. And when we are looking at this through an OD lens, we're focusing, it's leadership, communication, structure, and employee engagement. Those are kind of your main buckets that everything else is going to fall under, like even technology, that could be structure, that could actually, it could be any of these, right? But typically they're going to kind of fall into one of these 4 buckets. All right, so choosing a model, and these are presented in your textbook. And some of them you may be familiar with, some of them you may not have heard of, and that's okay. Or some you might know by name, but not what it does. So as you're working through your project work, you're going to be thinking about what kind of model might be appropriate for what I'm facing in this organizational situation that I'm looking at. So if you haven't spent some time kind of just becoming a little bit familiar with these models, it might be helpful to do so that you can kind of almost side by side, right? Here's the model, here's my situation. Does this one seem to fit? Could, maybe, or nope, not at all. Rule that one out, move on to the next one. So open systems, I did not link this to any kind of explanation. Again, these are all in the book, but I didn't link this here because it's pretty, most of you have been dealing with open systems and you know what they are. SWOT, I think we've all been doing that since Business 101 in undergrad. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Some, if you're doing, you can, flip that. There's a TOES analysis as well. But again, we're all pretty familiar with those 2. So I put the others that I wasn't sure how familiar people might be. I'm not going to go into each of them, but they are clickable and you can go through them. On the next slide, I actually have the visuals for those, actually for all of them, not the open one, because that's pretty basic, but for the others. And this is really just an example here where the other ones kind of give you more of like the basic categories. This one, it could be like within the balanced scorecard, these are your 4 sections, right? But you could have different KPIs, like machine downtime might not apply in every industry. So this is really just an example here of this one. This is your 7 S's, which if you haven't, looked into that yet, this is a pretty widely accepted model. We get good old SWOT over here. And I chose an image that showed the internal and external just so that everybody was clear there. These 2 are the ones that I would say are a little less known, the McKinsey growth pyramid. And this one here, basically it shows the pyramid, first of all, right? And then kind of what it's connecting to, like, how is this accomplished? So again, if your intervention seems like it might align with this, that's, none of these are a bad option to use. Some are a little less complicated, obviously, than others. And your organizational situation very well could probably fit into any one of these. So it's really just choosing where you think it fits best and what you're comfortable using to go forward. All right, so data collection. I've told you before, I really like this textbook. And one of the things I like about it is it, it doesn't, OD is kind of one of the soft subjects, but it really takes us into frameworks and it takes us into the theory behind it. It takes us into the data that helps to develop these interventions and assess them, right? So I think it gives a really good holistic view of interventions as opposed to just, and OD as opposed to just, here's what the interventions could be or are. It gives you that whole look here. So when we're collecting data in the diagnosis phase, but also in the assessment phase, these could very well be the same. These are some ways we would collect data. Pretty common. I don't think anybody would have questions about those. These are just common data collection approaches, right? So this is like what you would do for OD or for anything else, and for a potential dissertation. These are just basic data collection options. When you're thinking about your sample, so how large should your sample be? For this course, we don't have to worry about that so much because your sample size will typically be dictated by the level you're doing your intervention at. So whether it's organizational or, departmental, small group, we talked about this last week, probably not going to be individual, but of those three levels, that's really going to dictate your sample. And for most interventions that you're doing within your organizations, you're going to include everybody within whatever level you choose, right? So if we're doing an organizational intervention, like everybody's going to do this, or our department, we're not going to leave 3 people out, everybody's going to do it. However, where this could be sort of a population sample situation is if you decide that you want to do an intervention within the organization, but you want to start with a sample, kind of a pilot, you might be doing it with 1 department or 2 departments. So that's where you might get into sampling. If you're doing this for research purposes, then certainly you will definitely have a population and sample situation. And when you get to that, because again, for all of you, it's coming, or I shouldn't say all of you, because I forgot we do have some transfer credits in here, but for most of you, this is coming soon. And how do you decide how big of a sample you need? So you can relax because there are ways to figure that out. And your methodologist and your advisor will certainly help you with that. But if you're doing a quantitative study, you do something, and you may be familiar with this already if you remember from quantitative, you do a power analysis. So an a priori power analysis where you will actually walk through a calculation to determine how large your sample should be. If you are doing a qualitative dissertation, you will still kind of do a power analysis, but one geared towards qualitative. We have some resources in the statistics primer. I believe it's under other resources, and in there's power analysis. And when you click on it, there's a tutorial that's great that Dr. Hughes developed. And in that, there is also for qualitative, there's an article in there. So don't stress over this, especially not for this course, because it's not totally applicable here. But as you go forward, we will, help you to figure out, and you'll have the tools available to figure out how many people you need for your research. This is kind of a loaded question because, what is the sample size is dictated by the population size, right? Like if there's only 20 people in the population and we choose a sample, it's going to be a lot smaller than if there are 20,000 people in the population. So the size, the confidence level desired, this is all about your validity, like how credible, valid do you want these results to be? So if I have a population of 20,000 and I survey 5 people, probably a little bit low on the validity scale there and the credibility of my data collection, analysis, everything, right? It's 5 people. That doesn't tell me much out of 20,000. If it's 5 out of 20, that's different. So if I'm looking at 20,000 and I have 5,000, well, okay, that might give me a higher confidence level, but you know what? It's a lot more expensive and probably more difficult to get 5,000 people than it was to get the 5. So is there a happy medium? So it's, to what extent does your organization want that confidence level, and are they willing to pay for that? Because the higher the confidence level, the more people, the more resources, the more money typically, and then available resources. So do you have access to these people? And as you start to think about your dissertations, one of the questions you always want to think about with your topic direction is, will I have access to the data? Is it something that, if I need generally speaking, for dissertations, you're going to need about 100 people per variable or factor. So most dissertations that we do require just 100. Some will require more. I had one 2 years ago, required 300 because she had 3 different factors. So, are you going to have access to that? I'm not going to get too much into the data collection for dissertations more than I already have right now. But there are panels you can purchase. There's things that can be done to help make sure you have those numbers, but it is certainly a consideration. Will you have access to this? I can't tell you. At first, when we first started this program, we had one student it happened to, and now I've seen it a few times where somebody says, oh, I'm going to be able to collect data within my organization, which also has all kinds of issues. But let's say you do it. Well, what happens if your employment's terminated voluntarily or not while you're working on your dissertation? So these are, things to consider. All right, the selection approach in terms of how will you choose a sample. So again, it's covered in your book, but we aren't going to get too far into this for this course, on kind of a surface level. So we don't need to spend too much time there, but just to know that difference of simple random, where every member in the population has an equal chance of being selected, and then stratified. So the population is divided into a number of mutually exclusive subpopulations, and a random sample is taken from each. So for instance, when something, is mutually exclusive, so they're in one group and not in the other, and we may divide those groups by factors, like I said, and the factors could be anything. It could be geographic location, it could be type of work environment, it could be anything. So for instance, the example I gave you with the student that needed 300, she was looking at workers in fully remote environments, hybrid environments, and fully in-person environments. So she had a stratified sample looking, from the workforce, divided into those 3 categories, and then people selected within each category. All right. So I have a little note here. When possible, it can be helpful to collect quantitative and qualitative data. I would always encourage this in an organization. This is helpful for your dissertation. Mixed methods is not always the best way to go. It can be, but time-wise, you have to think about how much time you have. So again, that's for a later conversation as you move into your prospectus and talk to your advisor. But generally within an organization, it's not a bad idea to be able to get both sides if possible. All right, so diagnosis, data analysis. Under qualitative, your text for OD talks to you about content analysis and force field analysis. There's information in the book, and you probably also learned about these in qualitative. And then your quantitative tools. So descriptive statistics are pretty common. We use those a lot in dissertations. You'll see that in this textbook as well. And then the relationship between measures. So what is the relationship from one factor to another, and then difference tests. So you're looking at differences among your data. Good to know, good to read through in the textbook to understand how these relate to and what they might look like in OD. Also, because of the timing, seeing you are getting ready to go into your dissertation work, maybe not a bad idea to, some of you are going to be, looking towards topics that are potentially OD related, seeing that's what our program is about, although not everybody will, but if you are doing that, this is a good opportunity to kind of read through this in the text to maybe spark something for you and make those connections. All right, so report, communicate findings / feeding back the data, which I believe is what the section in your textbook is called. So this is when you are delivering the results. In an organization, we all know, especially when we work with consultants, right? They can collect the best data and analyze it and have like great analyses, but if it can't help us to understand what all that means, it doesn't do us much good. So it has to be presented in a manner to the right people, in a manner that is appropriate for the audience, right? So if you're presenting to executive leadership, that might look a little bit different than if you're presenting to all the employees in the organization. In your dissertation, in chapter 4, you're going to report the findings and pretty much only the findings. I like to, take the line from Dragnet, just the facts, but just the facts. You're just showing what your analyses showed you. And then in chapter 5, you're telling the story, you are interpreting those analyses. So you have to help the reader to understand, okay, I just read about, a chi-square analysis in chapter 4. Well, what does that mean for me? Tell me in chapter 5, how does that help? Tell me to understand what that's about. Tell the story. So you will be doing that in your dissertation, but obviously it's always important when presenting within the organization as well. And that's going to be part of your project work in this course as well. Talking about presenting and how that's going to be done through a meeting, through a series of presentations, through, whatever you decide. Typically just sending out a quick memo that says, hey, here's the findings, really isn't the most effective. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and stop recording, but please feel free to reach out if you have any questions throughout the week.